Alrighty. Uh, Good evening or whatever time of day for the one or two people tuning in. I am Awesome Ellie. Uh, here are the stream rules so far. Try not to be someone who causes an additional rule to be made. And today, on One Writing Wednesday, we're going to be like more reading and editing, but going through my web novel, Flipping Fantasyland, going through chapter by chapter, uh, reading what I have written and published so far, editing it as editing as appropriate, um, and hopefully chunking out a good bit of what I've already published before my voice starts getting sore, which will probably be the end of the stream. Uh, and yes, weird positive is acceptable. Weird negative, not so much. Here's some nice cover art, courtesy of one Juniper Poliska, who I probably butchered their name, but they were a pleasure to work with. If you want an art commission or something from them, or if you want an art commission or something, you get it from them. This is not an endorsed stream. They were just pretty great. I'm published through Royal Road, which is just a self-publishing site, chapter by chapter. Uh, and I will be bringing this up because I do have a fair number of chapters. Uh, there are user comments, some of which are catching mistakes and whatnot from the text. Will not be reading from here because the text is very small. Plus, cannot easily edit stuff over there. There we go. Prologue. One of the things that I'll also be going through as I work here is the first 20 something chapters do not have chapter titles. We'll also be thrown in chapter titles. I know what this one's going to be. The Entity. It was weird to consider an entity that worked at certain geological timeframes getting rushed by much of anything. Yet here he was all the same, falling into a tic he did not know he'd acquired, yanking at the hair along the back of his scalp. Not a personal kind of nervousness, far from it. Doubt in his designs and actions had fallen away hundreds of worlds ago. Instead, it was impatience at progress he felt should have been made already. The stakes were ultimately low for him, which only made it all the more irritating that things did not immediately hop into step with his grand orchestra. It was wildly successful. He was wildly successful in his line of work, priding his masterpieces on how efficient they were and how they grew and harvested and ate. So of course he had been more than magnanimous and taken on a world from one of the other developers, perfectly assured and assuring that the troublesome project could easily be brought up to the standards of his work where others were less than successful. Not that their successes ever matched up to his own, of course. And so far, things were going well, just a tad bit slowly. The limits that all developers dealt with and how directly they could interfere were all part of the business, as was the easiest way around it. To plant seeds plucked off of an established world and place them where you felt they were needed on the one you were working on. The key to the entity's success was how he picked his seeds, though. Half through luck and half through creatively bending the limits on how much one could interfere, he had cultivated a plethora of tests of sorts across his more successful works that helped him pick out optimal seeds. The best part was how he had dressed up the tests, disguising them as games that dealt with all sorts of different people, scenarios, imaginary places. giving plenty of information for him to feel out some of the bigger changes when one moved a seed, even acclimating their minds to whatever form they might take on wherever they landed. He would never admit it, but early on his choices of seed always seemed to do rather poorly, self-destructing before they got their work done. This does feel like it should be early on in his career. As he stopped to bask in his own brilliance and how he only had seeds that self-destructed after their work was done now, as guided by his tests, it struck him that the problem was on the current, or it struck him what the problem was on the current project. Problem World, where the underlying rules were highly mutable compared to most, was a dangerous, fragmented place as it was now. The entity had sprinkled plenty of choice candidates that would reshape the cultures present, to then work on taming the world itself, using all the knowledge, artifacts from the bright and shiny and hungry societies they originated from. But all of his seeds were safe and cautious, both too safe to reach outside of the patches he had planted them in, or perhaps too safe. And he needed them to reach, to wind their vines across the world's peoples, and ensure that everything was brought in line. With that in mind, he considered the best way to agitate the environment. It could not be too great, else the consequences would disrupt his other seeds. Instead, he needed a candle that would burn bright but briefly. Brightly but briefly, he decided. A seed that would make a local splash but quickly get swallowed up and choked out by its competing seeds. A catalyst that would react but quickly consume itself and then the resultant reaction. Something that would be just enough to get things moving. From there, it was only a moment to dig through potential candidates, focusing on the results of his precious tests that had yet to steer him wrong. That mutable nature of the world to be developed narrowed some of his considerations with who would be able to mentally handle that, but he wanted someone who would not mess with those fabrics either. Someone who would hate where they would wind up to force them to move elsewhere. Someone who would not get along well with local powers to ensure that they could not do anything to win over their betters on the ground. Someone volatile enough that, given the dangerous nature of the world, they would certainly not last too long in their new home. Someone familiar with just enough the details of the developing world that they likely would not break immediately. The other factors that he typically weighed, he paid little attention to. This seed would not be there to prosper, only to break ground for the ones that mattered. It made for a swift decision, a nice change of pace. Sorry, lost my place. A nice change of pace from the antsy sitting and waiting that had been needling him. So, with the relief that comes from a well-scratched itch, the entity reached out and snagged his newest and last seed from the world it was from. And the latest. Yeah, latest seed from the world it was from. A more recent success that had a stricter set of rules underpinning its existence. He inspected the seed for a brief moment before tossing it towards its destination with a flick of the metaphysical wrist. The matter thus settled, he decided to turn his attention elsewhere, happy to put the whole thing to rest for now. After all, a developer as great as he had many projects on his plate, some of which even needed his personal touch to flourish. By the next time he checked in, things should be well on their way toward where they should be, and that was vastly satisfying to know, deep down. Prologue looking good. In title already picked out. Chapter 1. The slight sucking at the bottom of her boots as she pulled them from the mud with each step, paired with the heavy, wet air that fought every breath, brought Mila uncomfortably into the moment, the fog of sleep still clouding the fringes of her mind. Not that she was not still sleeping, she decided after a moment's thought, feeling out the languid rush that she found herself in the midst of, finding it quite similar to the occasional lucid dream she had experienced before. Her conclusion was only pushed forward as more details calmly filtered into her mind, her surroundings slow enough to give her time to latch onto each piece and digest it. The most peculiar tidbit being that while it all felt slow, it very much wasn't. She was sprinting onward, tipped forward far beyond what felt safe yet controlled all the same, somehow not snagging her feet on any of the roots, fallen branches, clay slicks, or rocks that would spill a quick, shattered end to her ankles if she messed up for even a split second. The muggy, deciduous forest was drawn straight from back home, left years back, but grown to monstrous looming proportions that Mila tried not to contemplate the metaphorical significance of too much, helped by the distraction of one arm coming up and into focus enough to lazily observe. The soft skin she spent so much time to keep healthy and smooth was gone, replaced by small pink scales spattered by the red, clay-tainted mud that she was busy kicking up. A heavy, stout machete gripped tight, and a blunt-taloned grip should be hold to keep from using grip, so twice in the same sentence, angled out just slightly. See? The soft skin she spent so much to keep spent so much time. Let's see. Give me a moment, sorry. The soft skin she spent so much time the soft skin she spent so much effort to keep healthy and smooth was gone, replaced by small pink scales spattered by the red clay-tainted mud as she was busy kicking up. A heavy, stout machete gripped tight in a blunt-taloned hold, angled out just slightly. This feels weird. Just a second. Let's just set this to hand. Let's see. The soft skin she spent so much effort to keep healthy and smooth was gone, replaced by small pink scales spattered by the red, clay-tainted mud that she was busy kicking up. A heavy, stout machete gripped tight in a blunt-taloned hand angled out just slightly. One of two matching blades, she confirmed as her arms pumped. One of two matching blades, she confirmed as her arms pumped. Matching. Oh, matching used twice there. A weirder dream, then, it may be a sign that her role-playing game characters were growing on her too much. Perhaps was a bit too much of a self-insert, but the amusing observation was shattered before it could take hold too deeply by a shouted warning that was immediately drowned out and consumed by harsh cackling. A cackling that Mila was busy sprinting right towards, as the imminent obstacle managed to claw its way into her attention, despite her mind's best attempt to not recognize it as an existing thing within the environment. The creature was a canine ostensibly, but what should have been a tawny gray coat was marred by heavy patches of blackened fur, with ugly, scar-white skin peeking through. And it was massive, even before its weird proportions were factored in. Its legs were twice as long as they had any right to be, almost cartoonishly spider-like in how its body sat up high. But worst were its eyes and its paws, for a lack of a better term. The yellow orbs that had this spark of intelligence there that Mila associated with a smart animal solving a problem, but tainted with a feeling of cruelty that she exclusively thought of as much too human, locked onto her as she moved towards it, shifting its weight back and raising a foreleg, bringing a paw that was far too hand-like to get in between them, laughing hungrily as it moved. The yodel, because Mila just knew that it was a yodel, some awful mutation of a coyote, was not alone, but it was the only one that did not seem to be panicking at her mad charge at them. The other two, spooked by the person smaller than them acting aggressively, but the one just kept laughing, even as Mila planted a boot and dropped her weight, coiling amidst the mud for a moment. And then the spring of her own muscles, alienly toned, launched her forward through the air at her target, her own long mouth extending wide in an angry smile. The wild, distant leap threw her target off, as well as made the fourth yodel miss her arm with its snapping jaws as it de-shimmered into existence under her like the fucking predator, her mind only now helpfully supplying that the yodels could hide themselves from one's mind. Because, of course, they could. That horrific tidbit did not get time to settle in on Mila, though, as she was already batting away the reaching hand paw of her initial target, wrapping the flat of her blade against it to make its lunge go wide as she crashed into its chest. So, kind of obviously, this is a fantasy story. Lots of D&D type tidbits. Although instead of a primarily European-based fantasy setting, set in the Deep South. Minimal wolves, maximum mutant coyotes. Uh, I don't like the formatting of the full text there. I'm gonna have to go through the fonts at some point. Whatever. Her other blade flashed forward with her momentum, steel chopping forward as she got a face full of the disgusting beast's gross fur. But her body thankfully knew what to do as she slammed into the larger, far heavier dog. Her opened mouth found purchase, slamming teeth into the flesh of the beast's collarbone and clamping down, her chest coming to a lung shuddering stop against its body, but her lower body whipping forward, boots seeking a half-decent foothold against the scuffing legs of the yodel, her tail going wide, coated in the same bright pink scales that her arms and muzzle were. The long tail cracked like an angry whip as it found one of her yodel's back paws, wrapped around it, and tugged it out from underneath the creature. Mila rode the monster down as it fell, bracing for the second impact even as she kept her mouth clamped down, her own feet still scrambling, hands moving at lightning speed as she tried to simultaneously hack further into the yodel's muscle while keeping its furious, pained jaws off of her head and shoulder. The vile blood. I think we used a vile semi recently. Checking that. Nope. The vile blood rained over her as fast as she could move, a sliver of false hope present that she did not accidentally swallow any of it, and her vicious work had immediately turned the awful laughter into more natural, albeit still awful, canine cries of pain and distress as her victim did all it could to remove her. scuttling back over the muddy ground even as she continued to yank at the foot her tail held captive. There was a shudder and sag within seconds of her impact, and while blood still flowed, Mila knew that, for the time being, this Yodel would be out of the fight, which only served to remind her that there were at least three others of the freaks right around her, and that she could hardly hear anything outside of the hammering of her own heart. But she knew it was all loud. The red that creeped into the fringes of her vision was not helpful either. It was not blood, confirmed after she tried to clear off her eyes, and it did nothing for the red. So instead she whipped up, head darting left and right to figure out what needed taking down next. Eyes focusing on the Yodel coming up on her right and stepping back as concern took over. Mila's mind recognized for a brief instant that something was very, very wrong with all of this. Seeming to sense the moment of fear, the Yodel took a step forward, ready to press its advantage, but the squelch of a heavy footstep heralded an intercessor. A shining knight in mud-splash armor came through the peripheral, slamming a heavy steel sword down into the beast's back and dropping it to its knees before the large sword was wrenched free. Its wielder sported a breastplate, but it was the golden scales catching the light that really drew the eye. A tangle of similarly golden horns sitting upon her reptilian head and a stout tail shifting to balance her as she readied her sword to swing again. More knowledge bubbled up, providing Rora's name to Mila and explaining that the silver shimmering plates that flickered in and out around the other kobold were some kind of innate magic that the woman had. Magic of the moons, yet another fault line that cracked underneath Mila's mental footing. It was another moment of pause for Mila, pushing back at the sound of her heartbeat and at the red in her vision that wanted more, but that only let more of the chaos come through to her, trying to overwhelm her. Rora shifted, threatening to drop her two-handed sword on the grievously wounded Yodel as it danced forward and back. But there were more of the hell beast than she had thought, even as she gnawed on the neck of one of them. Just a second, double check continuity thing. Okay, she actually has already released. Oh, even as she had gnawed on the neck of one of them. I don't know if I necessarily like this. Just a second. The grievously wounded Yodel as it danced forward and back. But there were more of the hell beast than she had thought, even as she had gnawed on the neck of one of them. When she had been busy gnawing on the neck of one of them. The beast to her left was slammed back and away from her by a torrent of water, sending it rolling out of the way. But two others were before her, focused on her as they shimmered and slipped in and out of reality, staring with those eyes, seeing everything. They tugged at her mind, and her own mind found her wanting, easily throwing her to the not wolves as she was dragged further into their gazes. Rora's scream, a soft voice being forced too loud for the speaker's own comfort, shot through to her. Mila, behind you, duck. And duck she did, half throwing herself forward and managing to avoid the sixth Yodel's fangs that sought her neck. Unfortunately, it did not keep the beast from accidentally catching her now off balance with its paws, tripping over her and sending them both crashing into the mud, Mila trapped below its bulk. The crush of woman versus monster was much less in her control this time, with the one point to her benefit being that its long legs that she was tangled up in prevented the yodel from eviscerating her immediately. Just a second, there was a capitalized yodel up here that shouldn't have been. The crush of woman versus monster was much less in her control this time, with the one point to her benefit being that its long legs that she was tangled up in prevented the yodel from eviscerating her immediately. Its weight on top of her kept her from properly chopping with the machetes in her hands, but she tried her damnedest anyway, her tail slapping about in the mud as she kicked to free herself, and her mouth grabbing whatever she could reach and tearing away, releasing, and repeating. Between her own panicked sounds and those of the yodel, that could not seem to extricate itself from her, she had no idea what was going on outside. What's going on with the larger battle. But the same hers but not hers knowledge that knew what a yodel was also told her that Aurora and the others were likely doing fine. Better than her, and if she just kept on fighting, they'd save her. They had her back. That did not keep Mila calm, though, as her snout was smashed into the hide of the beast and its blood washed over her nostrils and through her mouth. Her frantic short movements and jerks only intensified when the yodel finally managed to sink its teeth into her thigh, a fang feeling like it glanced off her damn kneecap. Her own retaliatory chomp managed to land and tighten right before the canine began to hollow her from beneath it, her teeth shredding even as her blades struck as deep as they could, drawing long gouges as Mila was pulled out, and with a crack of the creature's neck, tossed away, apparently much more of a threat than worthwhile prey to her attacker. Hitting the ground shoulder first jarred her, even as she tried to bring one arm up to protect her skull, and she scrabbled through the slick, red mud to find her feet. The sharp pain of her leg and the dull ache of her mutant coyote-crushed chest was all shoved down firmly as the kobold spun about, not willing to get caught off guard again. Thank the gods, though, no more yotels seemed to be paying much attention to her as the three remaining were busy grasping on to the last vestiges of life they had and failing. The one that she'd been trapped under was taking faltering steps to escape, a pulped chest and armpit dumping blood too fast to last long, and a small part of Mila was glad to see that she'd given worse than she'd got. Aurora had another pinned down, the horn-crowned kobold's heavy sword cutting off the yodel each time it looked to slip past her and threatening to dive in if it tried to turn and run, which gave the opportunity for the thrown spears, larger than either of the frontline warriors, to sporadically slam home. The third yodel was reeling in a stupor to one side, its eyes filled with burning symbols as its mouth dripped with hunger-laden globules of saliva, and its body rapidly wasted away, muscles eaten up by the magics at work there, the work of a human man and a massive hyena person that stood a ways back next to a bluish fellow with the spears. The other yodels were down, dead, or dying, and the three soon followed, their death cries still managing to keep that cruel laughter buried within. But Mila did not have the thoughts to spare about it, too busy considering the cracks that were rapidly expanding in her mind. Magic and yodels and even kobolds were not real, but part of her was screaming against the other part, battering down the walls that separated them, because for as floaty as her thoughts felt, the agony in her body and the thick, burning hot blood that still coated her mouth and throat felt like no dream she'd ever had. Tasted like no dream she'd ever had. The very, very real taste of the yodel's fur, flesh, and lifeblood made her retch, stomach threatening to expel its contents onto the wet forest floor at her feet. But she managed to suppress it, fully aware that the acrid bile would not help her taste issues. And then her eyes fell down to the mangled, agonizing leg that somehow supported her. The fabric of her shorts just as shredded as the flesh below. Bits of too pink muscle, overly distinct from the pink of her scales, peeking through the blood that flowed down her leg. A glimpse of white, horrifying and all too reminiscent to how she had gotten herself a wide scar across her delicate, scaleless knee, was the final straw for Mila. Eyes rolling up into her skull as her strings were cut, body collapsing forward, and the cracks in her mind growing wider, trying to swallow her up, even as the banging continued inside her brain. She did not even manage to hear the cries of concerns from her friends, for as little comfort as that might have been for the panicking woman. So for chapter titles, I pick out a segment of the chapter itself to use as a title. Um, Something relating to the yodels feels best here, since yeah, I like a good in media res intro, um, and that is stacked up a couple of times over here. Uh, Also, admittedly, the group of main characters here, of which our viewpoint character is only one of, are actually pretty competent. This would be a lot less life and death for our main character not panicking the fuck out the moment things started going sideways. Uh, I'm glad you like it though. Also, the creepy hand coyotes are like, I feel pretty inspired. Uh, Dogs are great, coyotes not so much. Something about yodels is the chapter title. It was a yodel. Doc being a pain in the rear. The fourth yodel. A little bit nonsensical as the first chapter title without actually having read the chapter, but yodel. Took a step forward. Wounded yodels. The sixth yodels. The occasional lucid dream as a chapter title, or the fourth yodel. Yeah, these are very distinct from yodeling, the verb. Uh, should it be the occasional lucid dream or just occasional lucid dream? Is the participle, or sorry, the article there, is that an improvement? Keeping in mind that I don't think there are any like actual dream sequences in the work so far. I don't find them like as hacky as some authors do, but Chapter 2. Waking up, actually waking up from unconsciousness and setting, instead of finding herself in media res, was a blessedly slow process. Nothing felt or sounded pressing, which gave Mila plenty of time to put herself in order and consider all her thoughts. The largest singular one being that they were indeed all her thoughts. There at the end, before the sweet release of physical, shock-induced unconsciousness, everything in her noggin had felt like it was going to splinter apart around her. But now all was quiet. No more symbolic, ominous creaking to be had. I'm just going to go ahead and start highlighting potential chapter titles. Which was not to say that everything felt cohesive and right. There was an incongruousness to her mind, and that was what she began to pick at. It was weird to be feeling out one's own mind, to trace along the jagged outline. There was a solid core down the center, tall and firm and unshakable, containing all the things she knew to be absolutely true. The size of the stuff was irrelevant, but they all held the same immutable sense of being true. She thought, therefore she was, a fact she was uncharacteristically grateful for right this moment. She was smart, albeit often foolish. She loved spicy foods. She hated bugs. She knew that what went up must come down. Uh, any reason not to use incongruity? Probably didn't think of it in the moment. That reads a lot better. Thank you. Branching off of this glorious trunk of firmly known things, however, was where the edges ran rough. They were still things that Mila knew, but they lacked the unarguable weight of the other things. For each branch, swaying in the unseen dissonant breeze, there was a counterpart. Two facts that she knew, but that were at odds with each other too deeply to coexist. She was a kobold, a member of a bipedal reptilian species that were small compared to most other folks, but she was also a human, soft and squishy and monkey derived. She was a tall human, even. Worse still, that human Mila knew that kobolds were not real, instead firmly in the realm of fantasy games and poorly written web fiction. There's a decent bit of lampshade hanging on this being, you know, some good quality trash isekai. Uh, oh, just a second. I noticed my avatar is missing some arm bones. Sorry about that. And they're back. More branches and connecting tidbits between branches ran up and down the length of the trunk, all demanding acknowledgement and primacy as the truth, with no other demanding its place. Or italicized and bolded. I need to fucking change this font. The kerning on it is awful. Mila traced out through the branches, following that and similar threads, adding pieces together in a way that was a little too much like putting together a jigsaw puzzle with her own mind. These branch facts connected to these other branch facts and so on, grouping what was compatible with what into different piles and merging piles as they connected. A mental step back, once she had managed to get all those helpful edge pieces put together to see the shape of the thing, allowed her to grasp the whole after a few moments' consideration. She was Mila, yes, but there were pieces present for more than one Mila. Thankfully, there was only the outlines of two hers, the kobold and the human, but there was not enough present for two whole separate Milas. That was probably for the better, all things told, as she did not have to worry about a version of her fighting for control of their shared body or anything like that. But it fascinated her. The answer was there, though, in the shape of those jigsaw pieces. A given trunk fact, a central jigsaw piece, fit into both Milas with ease, the commonalities between the two outlined shapes. There were two Milas just as there were two metaphors, now permanently mushed together. She was both jigsaw puzzle and tree. She was pretty sure the greater metaphor fell apart there, actually, and as far as labels went for the two distinct different hers she was dealing with, useless and nondescriptive. Thankfully, her naming sense was shared as she swiftly settled on Mila from Fantasyland and the Mila from Science Land. But only because Science Fiction Land sounded wrong, and because another shared chunk helpfully let her know that the actual planets both of the hers knew were called Earth. Which does feel a little bit out of place here. The attempt here is to convey that these are two kind of parallel Earths, one fantasy, one. Oh, not. Sorry, adjusting volume. So hopefully less peaking the mic. Uh, that there's not a specific Earth Mila, they're both from Earth. So let's see. Only because Science Fiction Land sounded wrong. And Earthland was not descriptive. It was not distinctive, but only because Science Fiction Land sounded wrong and Earthling was not distinctive, as both Milas came from their respective Earth. Yes, I like that a lot better sounding. Feels a lot better. The shape of the matter figured out, Mila's mind dwelled on how that came to be. Drudging here should be dredging. That one is correct. Thank you, Google. Dredging up memories of psychology courses Science Land Mila had taken in an ill-advised attempt to earn respect from those who had never planned to give her any by getting a graduate degree. It was like all her knowledge and understanding of everything, her cognitive schema, for one Mila had been slammed into the schema of the other. The shared parts had merged just fine, being the same concepts, but that had left the rest remaining. Those conflicts, once she had really started to notice them, had overwhelmed her during the fight with the Yodels, creatures that decidedly did not exist in Science Land, further not helped by blood loss. Science Land Mila also had never torn into a living creature with her mouth, nor would she have been pulling herself up to her feet, ready for more with her legs so mangled. But for Fantasyland Mila, that was unfortunately more the norm than not. Fantasyland Mila was a badass, was her verdict. That was not discounting Science Land Mila at all, but that Mila would have looked down at the Kobold Mila, less than half her height, and been able to feel the badassery. All that to say, Mila mused, let's see, all that to say, Mila mused, was that she was a badass. She was both a gestalt. She was both, comma, a gestalt. Let's see, she was both versions. A gestalt Mila of Scienceland and Fantasyland combined. Putting that together, feeling it out, and finding it a new place within the shared trunk of knowledge was reassuring. It felt comfortable, gave her grounding from which to make her next decision, which, as time dragged on, needed to be turning her attention from her thoughts to her surroundings, the slight shifting down her back, and further letting her know full well that she had a tail and was very much still in a kobold body. The oppressively hot and humid air still weighed on her chest, trying to grab hold of her lungs from the inside to choke her out. But that unfortunately familiar feeling was about the only point of discomfort. Her leg, despite having done its damnedest tug rope impression for the yodel, did not hurt her at all, not even when she moved it a little. The tingly deadness of anesthesia was not there either, which meant healing magic was pretty damn useful. A fact that she knew as a branch, but she was reconfirming. Eyelids, both the scaled outer variety and a set of inner nictating membranes, weighed heavy, but Mila threw her mightiest will at them, managing a slow, bleary opening. Beige, so much beige, was there to meet her, and rocking her head to the side, away from the sun that stabbed at her brain, was just more beige, albeit with less backlighting. A canvas tarp was suspended above her, the blunt claws on one hand feeling below her to find another, and the walls of the tent were a heavy bug net, the soft drone outside letting Mila know just how happy she was to be on this side of the netting. It was partially her tent set up, though, so she would have been a little pissed if they had put her outside to get eaten alive. Mila rocked her head forward, grateful once again that she did not have the cranial horns like Rora, as she knew it made using her backpack as a pillow a right terror. Without them, she did not have to worry about poking holes in the waterproofing as she brought herself to sit up, finding her golden comrades sitting, glittering in a thin beam of sunlight. The annoyingly perfect positioning was clearly not on purpose either, as the armored woman lurched toward Mila as she sat up, concern worn clearly about her eyes and outstretched hand. Let me approve some of these edits real fast. That was not the hand that got to Mila first, though, as a mighty mitt with reassuring fingers and a thick, soft fur landed on her chest, damn near blanketing her whole torso. Okay. This is introing the third real character of the story. The entity, not going to show up a whole lot. And this character has a thick accent. I'm not really going to do it justice verbally. Bear that in mind. However, this character's great, so just bump it up a couple levels in your imagination, please. Give it that juice. Easy now, darling. I know how my healing goes. No getting up too fast now. Should also be no trailing G's. Came the comforting, smooth voice above her, as Nana carefully scooted Mila backwards a bit to lean against the pack she had been using as a pillow. Mila popped a glance up and to her left, a smile flashing momentarily to look up at the Knoll's face, stooped low to examine Mila with their caring dark eyes. Fantasyland Mila had never been in better hands, if asked in one of her rare moments of serious sincereness, and the worry present in their face felt good. As her eyes swept back through the pavilion-style tent, Mila could see that while not quite the same, everyone was worried about her. Eustace, a water elf presumably a long way from home, stood quiet in one corner, his light frown more expression than he usually wore. And Aluka was squatting on his heels, the human gripping a book on some magic or another, open with enough stress in his hands to let Mila know he hadn't turned a page in a while. The worry suddenly felt more oppressive than the climate, squeezing in on Mila. She had never been ugh, she had never been great at getting taken care of. Before it could get too harsh, though, her own body decided to break the ice on its own. I don't know where move got in there. Her own body decided to break the ice on its own, unleashing a voracious rumble from her belly. The canvas could not actually echo, but it felt as if it did so anyway, to make a point more than anything. And that was enough to drain away some of the tension in the air from Mila, as she and several of the others fell to snickering. She managed to contain herself for a few moments, enough to get out, "Yeah, I do know how it goes." Makes me think you're just healing me to try and evangelize, yeah? Doesn't matter how good the victuals are, I hardly think I could stand any vows. The standard refrain received a laugh and good-natured pat to the chest in return. Half holy person admonishing a heathen, and half doctor ensuring that their patient stayed in place. You'd make a terrible rector, Mila. Stick to your strengths, continue to serve as a great test for those of faith, came the rote response. The pouch of pan-fried greens and meat bits pressed into Mila's hands, undercutting any possibility for the words being taken seriously. Even then, Mila had long taken them to heart. It turned out that being a test of faith for one who followed the goddess of feasts really just meant eating a lot of food. The food prepared by the goddess's followers, in turn, was typically amazing. The doctrine of no evangelizing and the fact that their holy book was largely a book of recipes helped a lot in Mila's eyes, provided her with plenty of notes that she felt other deities should use for their own stuff. Mila's claws picked at the flap of the pouch, trying to get it to stay open without getting grease on the hand holding the bag, already knowing there was no saving her other hand from its imminently oily doom. A thumb and forefinger darted in to snag the tip of something asparagus adjacent, and she tossed it into her maw, reveling in the offhandedly precise coordination it demonstrated. And the food was damn good, too, easing her stomach's protests slightly, although she was still anticipating plenty more. She swallowed her first bite and breathed out to look back across the group. Sorry about that, y'all. Didn't mean to worry you. While Nana's accent was the strongest of any of theirs, enough that Mila reckoned they should be finding a weapon for it, she could still hear the traces of one not too dissimilar in her own voice, as hard as she tried to stomp it out. Not that she would turn her back on some of the vocabulary, though. Y'all might have started down here, but as far as Mila was concerned, y'all was for everyone. Are you sure you're alright? Your leg wasn't that bad. Did you hit your head or anything? Rora asked, not buying the words as she swayed forward and back, unsure how to help. Despite their similar backgrounds, Rora's accent was neutral when using the human tongue. Mila frowned as she fished out a piece of meat. Bristly and tough, the chunks were not supposed to be eaten, instead helping to flavor and preserve the vegetables. But Mila's teeth were this side of a shark's, so the morsel was good, if mildly more work. The frown was, in spite of that, weighing the dissonance. The injury had been horrific for Science Land, a maiming that would have put her out for weeks, maybe months or longer, depending. But Rora was right, because she had stood up, uncomfortable as that had been, and was now utterly fine, ignoring some snackiness that had come with the eating aligned divine healing. Food swallowed down, Mila did her best to lie by telling the truth. Nothing rattled too badly, feels like. I don't know what caused it. If I start getting belligerent, though, she trailed off, wondering what would have caused a whole mind to get dumped into this body, not sure if she liked any given answer. Then we'll know you're fine, came the jab from the corner, Aluka now relaxing enough to get into his book properly. He and Mila were constantly verbally scrapping, which maybe was not the healthiest form of friendship, but it was their friendship, so critics could stuff it. That Mila and Nana also joked with each other using semi-barbed jabs did have the pink kobold momentarily consider that maybe it was a her thing, but she moved away from that thought before it could take root. Instead, Mila just smiled wide and gave a hearty, damn straight, before chomping into the next bite. Eustace did not talk much. a fellow who preferred listening to speaking, but the silent chuckle that he gave was enough to signal that Mila seemed fine to him. 2. Added to Nana's contented hum. The temporary patient looked straight ahead, and it looked like Rora wanted to say something, but the words did not come. Mila just gave her a small smile and offered the opening of the pouch, allowing her to carefully extract a snack for herself. Although the knight took just one. Mila kept munching. Mila kept munching, a few questions coming through between the exercise of determining if each vegetable she was pulled out was Fantasyland exclusive. About half had an immediate Scienceland counterpart, the other half she did not know. Her going down at the end of the fight had not put anyone else in danger, a bone deep relief since her job within the group was to keep the others safe by being the most visible target. She had been out for an hour or so, which was longer than should be, explaining Rora's extra concern. The big question, though, was when she had trouble getting out. Whether the Yodels were responsible for the missing group of hunters they were out in the sticks looking for. Just a second. Drink some water. Stay hydrated. Eustace gave his short, clipped analysis rapidly. Large pack too far south. They were half starved, no den near either, no campsites. The elf was a long way from home, and the way each word softly rolled into the next carried with it whispers of a faraway, exotic land. Or, more accurately, some unknown town or city by the coast that nobody else knew of, since none of the group could place the accent, and the man was unreasonably tight-lipped about where he came from. Not that anyone spoke of where they grew up much. For some reason, adventuring did not lend itself to those who made annual trips back home for the holidays. His findings meant that the job was still on, though. Most folk that had to leave the safety of civilization behind and move through the unwelcoming wilderness did so with some combination of slow caution, tools to disincentivize wildlife, or hired muscle, the weight of their pockets allowing. The Bletum boys made their living as trap hunters, and they managed a combination of all three typically, if one counted their own experience in a brawl as having muscle enough to swing a stick. And Mila knew that they were good at their jobs and smart enough to stick to their jobs. Her group had traveled with them before. But they were supposed to have returned from their last hunt 2 weeks and change ago. So they'd been sent out to find out why. Let me clarify some of this pronoun-wise. The boys were supposed to have returned from their last hunt 2 weeks and change ago. So adventurers had been sent out to find out why. Do what they could to fix whatever situation they found. Let's see. Their group being adventurers, of course, the kind of hired muscle that was less concerned about caution and not thrashing whatever came to call. The sentence feels weird. Give me a moment. Adventurers, of course, being the kind of hired muscle that was less concerned about caution and more concerned about thrashing whatever came to call. Adventures in action, although decent folk said it in the same way that said foolishness. Mila had a lot to say about the same so-called decent folk, though, particularly when they came offering coin for jobs they could not handle on their own. That she was ready to give those opinions at the drop of a hat likely played a part in why she was rarely present for the actual job negotiating. They had yet to hit the end of the Blenheim's range. They had also found no sign that they had started making their way back home either. Given that several of the hunters had families, it did not seem likely that they had scarpered off to some other city-state either, much less the supplies to do so. Altogether, things were looking to be more of a recovery than a rescue, and that hung over everyone. Their jobs were rarely pleasant, even before factoring in the god's forsaken environment, but the general bleakness for that particular one was rough. Nobody could let that drag them down too much, though, not yet. Only after they were back and away from the quietly ominous danger of the wilderness could they really allow themselves to feel it. But for all that hard-eyed, steel-souled bullshit, they had each each had it drilled into them. Breaking their temporary camp was still a bit slower than usual, with Mila worst of them all. Fantasyland had hardened Mila to this kind of shit, to an extent, but Science Land had nothing like it where she had lived in it, even if when she closed her eyes both halves told her that this overall environment was largely the same, some level of home. It did not help that the others each casually used small bits of magic offhandedly, which kept catching and holding Mila's attentions, even if one had asked the cope. Let's see, this is about to get broken up too. It did not help that the others each casually used small bits of magic offhandedly, which kept catching and holding Mila's attention. Even if, had one asked the kobold 24 hours ago, she would have waved off magic and instead boasted that she had no need for the stuff herself. Let's see. Now, it helped that the others each casually used small bits of magic offhandedly, which kept catching and holding Mila's attention. If one had asked the kobold 24 hours ago, she would have waved off magic and instead boasted she had no need for the stuff herself. Yep, that's better. Mila from Science Land would have jumped at the chance to use magic, because obviously it's magic. So the fact that she was the one person here without magic herself made the wonder all the greater. That the little tricks seemed largely logistics centered did not dampen her sudden interest in Eustace creating water to wash off the canvas, and Aurora imbuing the fabric with silvery moonlight for a moment, long enough for the water to bead up and sprint off, leaving dry, and, with Mila's help, folded fabric in its wake. Nana offered up a quiet prayer that blessed the remaining food, keeping it safe and fresh as they repackaged it, and Aluka gestured out a diagram rapidly, some odds and ends in his hands as he dropped magic across all of them at once. A sound barrier of some kind that Mila could almost just hear, that she recognized as a field that would do its best to turn away the nibblier bugs. She had items imbued with magic, of course. They all did, all agreeing with the need to reinvest in themselves from the start of their joint venture. But no weaving magics from the esoteric or the divine for her. Yet that Fantasyland fact did not quite sit well with what she knew of Scienceland, what she now knew of Scienceland. And not just because of a small patch of jealousy she now had that she'd have to sate by looking into magic bit more later on. The way the fight with the Yodels had gone was anything but well, yet so much of how she had felt in the spaces between the panic had felt not quite right with how she had experienced Scienceland. Obviously not to the point of conjuring water from nothingness, which either played hell with conservation of mass or had some alien hyper-efficient reverse electrolysis at play. It had not felt normal either. She had been moving fast as lightning and knew that was normal for her, but also knew that moving that fast was not, in fact, all that normal. And not in the way that a marathon runner could run laps around Joe Normal kinds of not normal either. Her lingering gaze on Rora as the other kobold once more spun up the faintly existent plates of distilled moonlight to sit over her physical armor, while sitting beneath the forest canopy filtered afternoon sun, was introspective as she weighed that dissonance. She was shaken from her contemplations by the hearty thump of the golden kobold's tail, a great bit hardier and much less of its own mind than Mila's, smacked the ground. Let's see, from her contemplations by the hearty thump of the golden kobold's tail, a good bit hardier and much less of its own mind than Mila's, as it smacked the ground, the armored woman not even rocking from the movement. A glance to her face had Mila noting that the slightly puffed up scales across her cheekbones, the reptilian equivalent of a blush, and she realized just how hard she had been staring. Before she could mutter an apology for it, though, Aurora stepped forward and slipped into the pitched, chirping native tongue to ask, "Are you sure you're all right? I..." She trailed off, but Mila flashed her a wide grin, much more teeth than most would be comfortable facing point blank. Aurora was in the minority that she did not flinch, even if she did not look reassured in Mila's condition. "You saved my net scales in that fight, is all. If it weren't for that, I wouldn't be all right, but here I stand, tall and proud." That at least got the concern in Aurora's eyes to fade a bit, even if it was accompanied by a soft snort, Mila being a couple inches under Aurora's height, ignoring the horns, and the both of them half the height of any of the others. "Your work making up for tallness with pride is impressive indeed, O mighty one," Aurora intoned, faux seriousness audible, but her yellow-golden eyes bore their gaze into the pools of venomous green that Mila sported, trying to dig something up through the bluster, unsure of something. "You've just been..." Another wander off into silence, Aurora at a loss for words, which was rather unusual, even if she trended towards being much more thoughtful than Mila's problem of constantly speaking off the cuff. Mila stepped into the gap. I got my bell rung. Yeah. And but it's hardly the first time, and I'm already feeling better. Now let's start beating feet before the others get grumpy. Last thing we need is them getting in trouble without us there to save their mammal asses, right? She broke into her harsh gut laughter, if only because they had all learned that lesson several years ago and had come through intact. A small, calloused hand snaked out to pat Roar's shoulder reassuringly, though, as Milla started to move past, her tail coming up as she walked. Her tail coming up as she walked to slide against Roar's hip. No matter what was going on with Mila, she was more than ready to do her job. And if that meant gutting a few dozen more yodels, so be it. Only a chunk of chunk of pages. So for chapter titles, hard-eyed, steel-souled bullshit, out in the sticks, both jigsaw puzzle and tree. No more symbolic, ominous creaking. Kind of feeling bouncing this one as a title. Okay. Sorry, punched the mic there. Jigsaw puzzle and tree. Out in the sticks. Hard-eyed, steel-souled bullshit. I am leaning towards hard-eyed, steel-souled bullshit as the chapter title here. Because in effect that is what the chapter is covering. Mila is not actually opening up about what's all going on with her shit. She's just bottling all up unhealthily. Don't be like this, kids. Sorry, hard-eyed, steel-souled bullshit. Okay. Let me see if I can't set up the chapters thing. Just a second. looking up how to set up a table of contents in Google Doc. Uh, it's annoying. There's a way to do it here. I really just want. Kind of a navigation bar type deal. Well, whatever. Onwards to chapter 3. More water. Thankfully, or sorry, chapter 3, hydration and system. Thankfully, there were not a few dozen yodels on the remainder of that day on their journey north. What they found instead was the remnants of a small, broken down camp, suitable in size for the 4 hunters they were looking for, with Eustace stating that it was old enough to be from when they were heading out. It was enough to let them know that they were likely still on the right trail, that the job was not over yet. Beyond that, it was more of the same, a rather unpleasant proposition for the spring season. They were on one of the major roads between cities, but that hardly meant anyone was splurging on the luxury of hauling out stone to pave anything. Instead, it meant that the road proper, a 10-foot wide strip of the path, was a swampy mess from yesterday's rain, the sprouting plant life in the mud yet to be choked out by the red clay, and the heavier vehicles that would come by once things started drying out. I'm actually going to take a break here. I'll be right back. I'll put y'all on the holding screen. I think a fourth viewer just hopped in recently. Uh, you're catching me going on break. I'll be right back. Gotta refill the water. If you see the avatar moving, that's either me coming back or a cat moving across my workspace. There we go. Sorry about that. I am back. Still here. Chapter 3. Not willing to trudge through that, all the mud stuff, for no benefit, especially when the sucking mud would be closer to waist height for waist deep. For Mila and Aurora than not, the adventurers were marching on the scraggly, root-held earth to the side of the road. Still slick, but with more footholds and a lot fewer bugs trying to get up to them. Mosquito larvae were plentiful. Mosquito larvae were plentiful in the wide mud pools that were more a seasonal feature than a recent result of the precipitation, and it made them a plentiful bounty for the pollywogs, tiny fish, and other bugs that were also using them as nurseries. Mila had never been to the ocean in Fantasyland, but given the prodigious size of some of the animals she did know, perhaps avoiding the beach was for the better. Science Land made the comparison easy, though. The routine, heavy rain and God's awful road conditions had created a long strip of artificial tide pools. There were certainly small ponds and creeks and the like around, their traveling having brought them up out of swamp land a few days prior, but none of the big fish in those ponds were here to disrupt the micro ecosystem. Mostly, anyway. One bit of excitement that kept everyone on their toes was when a furious buzzing overtook them from behind, Mila spinning fast and still struggling to follow the massive damselfly that blew past them along the water, the pitch of its wings Dopplering amusingly. The others did not seem quite able to make it out as it moved past, and they were still getting ready to fight whatever was upon them, but Mila waved them off. No worries with that, she ain't coming back around. Busy having fish for dinner? Probably fish. Her knowledge of Fantasyland critters was not complete, and the catfish frog thing it had been carrying was one of those gaps. Science Land had absolutely none of that bullshit for either creature she had seen, not since a few mass extinctions ago. That thought tugged at her mind enough to make her realize that a lot of things had managed to squeak by big extinction events here, including dinosaurs. They were mixed up into some darker thoughts along the Fantasyland branch of her mind, weirder feelings about religions mixed up in there, but that the tyrant lizards were out in the world got the Science Land side very excited, tugging at the tangled knot of feelings that with fierce demands to not taint dinosaurs with bullshit she did not like. After all, she had seen Jurassic Park. She knew better. Dinosaurs were awesome. She was thankfully pulled back. Sorry, doing a highlight. She was thankfully pulled back before she got too jittery about possibly seeing real dinosaurs, as Aluka asked, she? He was in the middle of the group, and Mila turned back to look him over. With one eye, she sheathed her knives. The others still looked a little concerned, but were relaxing as the bug continued to not circle back. A damselfly, she said, then noting that nobody seemed to recognize the name, which was because, as far as she knew, Fantasyland did not really make a distinction between the damselfly and the dragonfly. Because that distinction still existed and fit with the insects of Fantasyland, nothing conflicted from the science land learning that supplied the name. Immediately, Mila's blood ran cold, very aware she had done the thing she had not wanted to do. She had not quite figured out why, exactly, she felt so strongly about letting what she knew of Science Land out into the world here, or even mentioning what had happened, but she knew that it was not something she wanted to deal with right now. It was not even how the others would react. That she was potentially compromised and could not realize it herself was actually a factor towards letting the cat out of the bag. No, she was suspected it was more the books she had read back in Science Land, Mila being an equally voracious reader of trash in both worlds. A lot of isekai stories centered around making the new world like the old one. And colonialist theme bullshit aside, Mila did not have the most positive thoughts about a lot of how Science Land operated. But that one tidbit about thrice damnable bugs had slipped out, and Mila tried to shrug it off. Damselflies are like dragonflies, but thinner, more delicate. Damsels and dragons, naturally, she said, a little irritation slipping in. While dinosaurs were very cool, Mila's thoughts on dragons, well, they can be described as ungenerous. Calling the whole type of bug damsels, though, seems kinda sexist. For the boy flies and the other flies, you know? Mila rolled her eyes at Aluka's good-natured, amused observation. Clearly they are all just she-her flies, boys and girls, and others alike. Not that I'm gonna listen too closely to what a human has to say on the topic too deeply. Worry not, small Mila. I know you would not listen to me, no matter what. Damn straight. The back and forth had the tension from her slip-up easing out of her, the tense muscles in her back relaxing a bit as the others chuckled at the silly discussion. Just a second. Damsels and Dragons would also be a decent chapter name, potentially. Relaxing a bit as the others chuckled at the silly discussion. They fell back to quiet marching, and soon enough it was once more time to set up camp as the sun slipped down into the distant trees. This time, proper camping without running off the road to tackle some yodels first. And Mila was even able to help a bit more than usual, some of those little tidbits from her stint as an Eagle Scout in Science Land coming through to help her manage the knots she never could get the hang of before. Their large tent setup, or sorry, scene break, their large tent set up, blankets set out, and fire built. The group then spent some 30 minutes chattering about nothing as Nana cooked up a hearty dinner. Everyone tore into it, each chomping through one steak and starting on a second before Mila made the false observation that it tasted like yodel. The observation was enough to make Eustace a bit green, his overall complexion turning an aquamarine that did not look particularly healthy. It waved him off the rest of the food, which meant more for Mila, which she happily snapped up. By the time supper had wrapped, the smoky fire was the only light left. Not that the dark bothered most of them. Due to their dependence on the fire, Luca and the aquatic elf were taking first and second watch respectively, the former pulling out a book as he posted up back to the fire. Everyone else ducked through their bug net and took their beds, Mila flopping out next to Nana's lanky frame and the curled up Aurora, who Mila looked at long enough to smirk. Aurora half looked like a slumbering dragon and half like the flittering pile of gold a dragon would choose as a bed. It suited her in a nice way. Mila did not fall asleep swiftly, and not for a moment did she pass that off to herself as being due to her taking a forced nap early in the day. Her mind was filled with a cacophony of thoughts and worries, most prominently that she would go to sleep eventually, and when she woke up, she'd be back to normal, be that in Science Land or Fantasyland. She could not figure which was less appealing, but what she could figure was that if either were to come to pass, she would feel less for it. Even if the Mila from Fantasyland did like the theoretical idea of being particularly tall, which the other one never quite leveraged like she would have. Never quite leveraged like she would have. And maybe even should have. Oh, the have is used there in the back half of the phrase. Leverage like she would and maybe even should have. It was all the faintest imagined silver linings. Ruminations continued as minutes dragged by, slowly dug out from under Mila and torn away from her grasp. The pink kobold let out a deep breath she did not know she was half holding when the big knoll turned over, Mila catching the gaze of their dark brown eyes and half jumping. She let it go, though, as Nana gave her a small smile, curling forward a little bit to draw closer. Nana had never made claim for leadership of their little pack of misfits, as most groups of adventurers could best be described. It had never been put up to a vote with everyone present. But all the same, they all knew that their tallest member was the one to call the shots whenever shots needed to be called, and everyone else was unsure or in conflict. It was not by virtue of their height that Nana claimed that luxury, but instead the careful, near parental attention that the knoll gave the others. Unlike Mila's actual parents, either set of them, that meant managing to both bring the kobold in close enough for a quiet, reassuring comfort, and refraining from the choking tightness of direct contact. Mila did poorly with the casual physical closeness that so many others easily handled without a thought, especially given that most kobolds were raised in cramped, close quarters. But Nana did not crowd her with that, while still giving her that closeness, not forcing her to fight against the mix of outward and inward anger. That violated personal space brought. Mila, Dolan, they spoke quietly, barely a whisper. Couldn't sleep either? I was worried about you earlier. We all were. Mila was unsure whether Rora and Eustace were actually asleep or just polite enough to keep pretending. Either way, the soft whisper of the much larger person had a way of being felt in your chest, so the quietness of the whisper sure was not it. And it's also wonky. Either way, the soft whisper of the much larger person had a way of being felt in your chest. A certain And that soft rumble way of either way, the soft whisper of the much larger person had a way of being felt in your chest, and that soft rumble had a way of bringing a certain calmness down over anyone. I'm fine, I'm fine. Not enough blood loss in the world that a good meal can't fix. A good meal can fix a lot, but not even my cooking can fix everything. We're all here to help with the rest, though. I'm not broken or anything, my leg is all good. A soft shush slithered out of the furred muzzle. Nobody's saying you're broke, you daft woman. I'm saying we're here for you. Not prying, not accusing. If today, or any day, takes a lot out of you, that's okay. We're here for you, same as you're here for us. If and that means I gotta tackle a yodel or two, so be it. That got a snort out of Mila. Nana was a lot bigger than either kobold, but both reptiles leveraged what they had much better in a fight. Any yodel getting sacked by Nana would have to be infirm already, well on his way to whatever afterlife cared for disturbing monstrosities that could turn a doorknob. The imagery helped, though, and Mila nodded her head slightly in the darkness. Maybe leave the direct heroics to Rora, though, Mila offered as a tidbit of unasked-for advice. Ha, she'd appreciate that indeed. I'll keep it in mind. Nana began to shift back away, their words delivered and job done for the time being. But Mila started, almost saying something before clamping her mouth on the words. It was enough for the gnoll to pause, though, a furry eyebrow raised in silent question. Instead of answering aloud, Mila just moved forward slightly, rolling on her side a bit closer and offering her right arm up into the air in an empty half embrace, unsure what to do or even what she really wanted. Thankfully, Nana was able to read through the awkwardness just fine, slipped toward her, one heavy arm slipping up to pull Mila in and half off the ground. The hug was not tight, but it was firm in the meaning that it channeled, and Mila pressed her face into the fur along the mammal's collarbone for a deep few seconds. It was not until she started to pull away that she talked, Nana smoothly lowering her away. Thank you. You give very good hugs. Mm-hmm. I know. I practice. That got another snort out of got another snort of laughter from Mila as she flattened herself on her back once more, the gnoll moving away. Everyone here had her back, and she had known that, but the reassurance felt great to have nonetheless. And that was all she needed, it turned out, as without the roil of doubts inside of her mind, sleep swiftly ambushed Mila, much in the way she was used to ambushing, and the hours rolled over her easily. Perspective titles, I know, I practice. Damsels and Dragons. She had seen Jurassic Park. I like I know, I practice. mostly because it sounds like it's for an upcoming kind of cool fighting, combat, or boasting badass chapter. Uh, and low, it's actually just about supporting your friends. So, which, perhaps spoilers, is a large component of the overall work. Chapter 4. Nothing much of note happened the following 2 days, aside from a lone, unlucky deer crossing their path that in turn supplemented their rations. A totally normal, not creepy deer, Mila observed, a bit glad for it. It was of the nature of animals and monsters that Mila whiled away many of her bored hours trudging. Apart from sorely missing the smartphone that she now knew existed somewhere, the loss of easily accessed music stung sharply to the very unmusical Mila. Science Land was chock full of animals, each in little categories that nested in each other and next to one another in a great big taxonomical tree that described all the things. Mila knew it was not actually all that clear cut, given discussions of how fish were not actually fish and how Schrodinger's brontosaurus seemed to be a thing, but there was still a method to how they were all looked at. And within Science Land, when imagining magical realms of apparently not so non existent, uh, oh, this definitely needs a clarification, cleaning up. And within Science Land, when imagining magical realities of apparently not so non existent realms, uh, it is a cute subversion. We love our mental health subversions. Support your friends, be supported by them, be open for that. Notably, not being open is definitely one of Mila's character flaws. And within Science Land, when imagining magical worlds of apparently not so non existent, when imagining magical worlds within apparently not so non existent realities, it always seemed that monsters were their own category of thing. In Fantasyland, in their own separate category. In Fantasyland, not so much. While Mila could not haul off and sling a spell for the betterment of anybody that would have ever argued with her in the past, magic suffused the world and all its inhabitants, adding another factor to all of its elements. Monsters were not some separate category of thing. That involved too much magic or something. Instead, the term had a much more practical meaning, in that a monster was any animal that was not so sure that people were at the top of the food chain. The Yodels were monsters, more than willing to feast on a foolish person or two if given the opportunity. The fist-sized red thing that looked like it was half bird, half shark, and half buzzsaw was just a regular critter, even if nobody in the group could put a name to the weird flying thing other than noisy pest. People was naturally just as nebulous yet practically inclined in its meaning. People could communicate with other people was about the start and end of it. Most tried to get along well enough with each other, but a few were right assholes to everyone, and pretty much all people had friction with someone else. The loose feel for what constituted people was important, though, as it covered so many folks. She knew that Science Land was a world. She knew that Science Land, as a world, had been human exclusive as far as people went, but even starting with humans as a baseline, an obnoxiously present assumption that humans so often seem to purposefully ignore, the current Mila was very nearby in terms of what Fantasyland was very close. In terms of what Fantasyland. Okay, Jesus, really got to workshop this one. The loose feel for what constituted people was important, though, since it covered so many folks. She knew that Science-Land, as a world, had been human exclusive as far as people went. But even starting with people as a baseline, an obnoxiously present assumption that humans so often seem to purposefully ignore, the current Mila so often seemed, or sorry, the current Mila was very close in terms of what most Fantasyland people looked like, short a few feet of height and extra the tail and the scales. Hell, with the right kind of arcane spell, Mila knew that damn near anything could become people. Even really weird shit like inanimate objects or substances. Compared to that, the story she heard of ancient deep sea life becoming people after a long time did not sound so weird. A part of her was glad, though, that more than a few things Science-Land considered to be fictional monsters existed in Fantasyland, but as rarely seen entities. Griffins and krakens and the like were around, but unlikely to ever be something of concern for her, which was nice to know. For all that magic diversified all the animals and animal-like things in the world, it also diversified the environment, giving so many of them healthy niches to stay in that were far away from her. And that kind of distance felt pretty good to her. A nice, relaxing tidbit that the Fantasyland Mila had never weighed too much in her favor, perhaps rightfully more concerned with the things in the niches that she did have to deal with. On that third day, though, it was blessedly a critter instead of a monster that crossed their path, as alien as the thing was. Mila had no way to guess with any accuracy how much it weighed, but the thing was massive, some 20 feet long and half a dozen across, and particularly flat. It was a heavy blanket of wet, dark grain that awkwardly undulated across the forest floor, segments bunching up and stretching out in something that had once been in the same room as a rhythm. Luca had flipped through a book before getting a name for it and groaned as he revealed it to be the aptly named carpet moss, the group standing to the side as it hauled its way past them, shying away a bit when it seemed to sense their presence. Mila was halfway to crouching down, wondering whether it was moving like a large slug or what, but the imagined Mental image of untold little legs underneath was more than enough to dissuade her from that curiosity, hopping back up to her feet. Kinda seems like it's trying to get out of Dodge, she noted, watching the wiggling mass marching onward slowly. It did not seem injured across its body, but she did not know what an injury would look like for a big thing of fungus. Mosses were fungi, she was pretty sure, and lichen was a symbiotic of a symbiose a symbiotic combination of fungus and algae. She probably did not have those backwards. Her observation got a few grunts in affirmation and more dirty looks. Tempting fate was a thing in all worlds, and the presence of a rather creepy god of fate in Fantasyland only made such superstitions all the more real feeling. Mila blasphemed freely, but even that statement felt a little too inviting, so she bit back any defense she might offer up. She could swallow her lumps. They started moving down the road, vaguely where the critter had come from before it was out of sight under its own power, its moist sounds bouncing around the trees to be kind of relaxing if you did not know its gross source. It did not help that everything was marginally wetter than usual, another brief rainstorm sweeping through during the night. The foreboding that Mila had brought down on everyone was a funk that did not linger too long, at least, as a swollen creek had ruptured its banks, spilling over the road and sweeping the ground away enough to make them all filthy if they waded through, assuming the current did not knock Mila and Rora over outright. The golden kobold had the solution to their problems, though, and the others stepped aside to watch her work, enjoying a bit of the added, sparkly showmanship that came with it. Ladies, gents, others, please, allow me. Rora shook her hands out with a dramatic flourish as she lumbered forward with a smile, stopping at the edge of the slick slope down to the new waterway. Her arms went on high, nearly reaching up to the level of most of the group's armpits, and she held the pose, straining as she started to grab hold of power, affixing her grip to it. With great strain, helped by forces alien to anybody else, Aurora began to lower her burden down, silvery liquid pooling up in her hands and running down her outstretched arms, collecting against her chest in a shimmery ball of light. Once it was full enough, Aurora stepped forward into the void and heaved the power down, spiking it and exploding the ball against nothing in particular. The fluid moonlight exploded out just as her foot would have passed it, coursing across a thin plane of air in moments and congealing as the boot, sturdier and stiffer than Mila's own, struck down on it. The one footstep echoed across the growing surface from where the silver met grass by her other foot to out where it stretched across the gap, sounding like a gentle wind chime made for the most tremendous of giants. Aurora stepped all the way forward, the throwing motion forcing her out onto the spur of moonlight, but she made the not stumble look elegant as she swept back upright, tail shifting to keep her balance. The light that came from beneath her did not illuminate the trees or anything quite that dramatic, but the dancing shine did cast a radiant underglow to the knightly woman herself, a glow that nearly did not do nearly the same dramatic aesthetic for the others as they followed after Aurora, applauding gently the dramatic display. The Moonlight Bridge did not have significant width, nor did it arch across the gap in the road for structural purposes, but it did but it easily supported them all without a groan of complaint. On the other end, their golden bridge builder took a step to the side, still staying on the surface, until everybody else had crossed. When she was sure that everyone was back in the mud, even if it was not so deep here, only once she was sure that everyone was back in the mud, even if it was not so deep here, did Roar step off. The shimmering field immediately evaporated back to whichever of the hidden moons it had descended from. It was, after all, still early in the day. Gorgeous as usual, Mila admitted with a chuckle. Sure, she was certain that had been necessary. Sorry. Sure, she was certain that had it been necessary, she could have crossed the gap with a mighty running leap, but the others were hardly so acrobatic. Not everyone could put Science-Land track and field teams to shame. After all, plus this way kept her from getting quite as splattered with mud compared to what that jump's landing would have resulted in. Aluka let out a small whistle, still looking back at the channel some 4 or 5 feet deep. That'll wreck any. That'll wreck any trade through to Crawdell, though, until it gets fixed. We'll need to report it when we get back. There was a few transportation options that would not totally be SOL due to the damage to the road, but anything with wheels would be mighty fucked, Mila reckoned. Thankfully, one of the others would be the one to report it. Better that way, probably. Wonder if they were going to make a wooden bridge or a culvert and fill it in. Mila mused aloud, a thumb claw scratching at the underside of her chin. Eustace was taking a long drink from his water bottle, and while technically he could do it on the road, a small break was fine too, even if Rora did not seem tired from channeling and guiding her magic. Mila had an admittedly amateur and specific interest in the engineering arts. Well, mechanical and civil engineering, she now clarified in her own mind. Even if all the other kinds did not exist as specific disciplines here, she knew that they existed somewhere. And she even had a degree in the software variety, even if that actual piece of paper was long gone and none of the actual programming stuff was relevant in this entire world. Aluka had a similar interest in chemistry, but given how science was so often bundled up into one group, at the bookstore they had passable-ish workings of the other's interest. That was one advantage Aluka had on the question. There was one advantage Aluka had on the question, though. He was born into a wealthy family, so he knew how rich folk thought. And no matter what anyone said, rich folk were the ones making the decisions. It'll be a wooden bridge, but the enchanted engravings will never get put down on it to preserve the bridge. A couple years, it'll fall apart its bindings or fall to rot, and then I'll repeat. It definitely felt like the correct answer, especially with the depressed venom he gave to it. But that could get people hurt. And how many bridges before it's more expensive than if they'd just done it right the first time? Rora interjected, looking a little horrified at what had initially seemed like the kind of nerd talk she enjoyed the chatter of, but could largely tune out. The mage and dervish both had a habit of wandering down large or long discussion spirals about things others did not much care about, as endearing as their excitement might be. Mila gave a shrug, willing to let the tall human take the question, which he did after a quick bit of mental math. The second replacement, so 3 bridges is where it'll cost more, maybe 4 if they go cheap on materials or workers, but that'll mean the bridges don't last as long. Rora looked like she had just bitten deep into a rind fruit you were supposed to peel, digesting that tidbit and putting it next to how this road was a moderately busy route when the skies were less busy dumping water down. It struck at a certain known truth within Mila, though. He was more pessimistic than the other kobold. Honestly, were she honest with herself, Mila was more pessimistic than the rest of the group most of the time. She reckoned that whomever got the job to build the bridge would keep getting the jobs, so by making a faulty product, they were ensuring future business. It's cheaper in the short term, so it's what fits the budget, was what she offered up as its own bleak consolation prize. Na nodded as if that explained everything, which in a way it did, and Eustace was busy chugging enough water to drown an eel, which was what was healthy for him. Rora still looked a little disgusted, though, gazing at where her magic had easily conjured up a bridge for them, and then down at her clenched hands, claws scraping against the small, delicate scales of her palms. Her solidified moonbeams only lasted only as long as she was in contact with them, unfortunately, so she could not just set one up and walk away. But she still felt frustrated that there was not something she could do. Mila knew the feeling, even without the ability to bend the forces of the cosmos to her whim. That Rora had not yet been suffocated by it over the years was sweet and played a role in why they had become friends years ago. Eustace broke the momentary contemplation as he pulled away from his water skin. I wonder how the carpet moss crossed. For Mila, that pulled up the mental image of the moss bunching up at one end and then shooting half of its body across. Its millions of theoretical little legs stretching out to grab hold, a woolly, spring-loaded inchworm from hell. She was bright pink and scaled, so her going green from nausea was not visible like it had been for the elf the nights before. Yet it was clear all the same as she spun about on one foot, shuddering at the horror. Thank you, Eustace, for letting us know it is time to move on, she firmly declared, rolling her eyes at the laugh her reaction caused the group. The others knew of her dislike of bugs. Hell, all but the elf were there for half of its development in a horrific misadventure involving a pool of carnivorous beetle larvae. But they never pushed the jokes past what she was fine with. Laughing at her imagining the fungus thing as insectile was well within the bounds. That it served as a salve for the sting that Roar's misplaced optimism had inflicted was all the more reason Mila was fine with it. Bleak Consolation Prize is a prospective title. The ability to bend forces of the cosmos to her whim. Sparkly showmanship. I kind of like, because this chapter is more about showcasing Roar's ability. Getting rid of Bleak Consolation Prize is an option. Sparkly showmanship or the ability to bend forces of the cosmos to her whim. I am kind of leaning towards the latter. After all, while Mila obviously surely can't bend the forces of the cosmos to her whim, Roar is doing that in this instance, so just, to make a bridge. I will admit, from a voice perspective, I don't do a lot of reading aloud. This will probably be the last chapter we cover, chapter 5, for tonight. I may stick around and poke at something else afterwards, possibly a video game. But, yeah. Chapter 5. The good mood coasted through the rest of the day, buoying the group with a bit extra pep in their step, even as the clay tried to bog them down. Relatively clear skies poked through the canopy, the cacophony of birds. Oh, just a second. Relatively clear skies poked through the canopy. The cacophony of birds seemed to have the flying bugs a bit under control, and the inane prattle between adventurers had an unfounded hope hidden within, or hidden underneath. Underneath. Mouthful of mouthful chapter titles, totally kosher. In fact, feasibly they bumped the word and page count slightly, so probably a good thing. Relatively clear skies poked through the canopy. The cacophony of birds seeming to have the flying bugs a bit under control, and the inane prattle between adventurers had an unfounded hope hidden underneath. It was in a sick sense of dramatic appropriateness, then, that everything came crashing down in the early evening light. The yodel pack that the group had diverted to clean up was a speed bump, but that was something that could be addressed directly. The wildlife trashed camp of the trappers had no easy answers, just unpleasant implications. There were not any corpses present, but CSI Fantasyland sweeping through the newly overgrown clearing only turned up worse and worse evidence. The tents, collapsed and torn up a bit as they were, painted the camp as one abandoned by its makers, and the rain, quickly growing plant life and the thieving critters mucked any tracks that might have been present before. Apparently, given the scraps of packaging and a bear bag that something had taken down from on high, the camp had been abandoned with plenty of vital goods still present. Most damning of all, a few precious personal effects were picked out of the mud and wreckage, put in a bag to return with. With mundane tracking out the window, the next stint of the job left Eustace's hands and fell to the other three magically inclined folk. Na played a long shot, giving a brief prayer for guidance and taking communion in a cathead biscuit form factor, although the circumstances surely made the snack taste of ash and did not spark any divine inspirations. Aurora channeled the higher powers a little more directly and snatched up 2 slivers of moonlight, concentrating intensely as she shoved the balls of magic into her own eyes, hands dropping away to reveal an alien gaze of unearthly light that peeled away a certain layer of the world to see more than was there. Aluka crouched down in the middle of the camp and began his own esoteric work, verifying math and tiny amounts of very expensive reagents before spilling forth words of man-made power to infuse his work. Mila could do jack shit in the moment, and it sucked. The human's dowsing spell gave the most obvious, actionable results as a powder rose up into the air from his hands and formed a needle-like arrow, even if the specifics of the spell casting put a damper on the man. The magic outright verifying what had only been strongly supported by the evidence so far. Outright verified what had only been strongly suspected by the evidence so far. They were recovering bodies. The corpse compass could not be moved, not without even more time and a lot more resources. But they would have to make do with the initial heading, magic, moon eyes, and a regular compass. At least on this somber stretch of the job, Mila could contribute. They were heading far off the road, and enough plants were busy staking their claim for the year that it would slow the group down heavily to push their way through. Mila had 2 knives that hacked through plants as effectively as they butchered whatever monster was pissing her off on a given day, and partnered with her lightning reflexes that meant any ambush was probably something she could react to. It made her the best trailblazer by far. That she had to sometimes jump up high enough to ensure a vine or two got removed for the trio of talls behind her was immaterial. While Mila was the tip of the spear, Eustace and Rora were the ones guiding her. The former had his compass and kept their heading centered, while the latter used her magic eyes to make minute corrections or note when it was best to go around an obstacle rather than through. Mila now had a healthy smattering of orienteering knowledge from Science-Land at her disposal, but the foliage of the forest kept any potential landmarks out of sight, which was part of what Roar's magics accounted for. That both of Mila's hands were busy chopping at greenery helped tamp down the newfound curiosity for magical pathfinding that she now vaguely had, which would have surely raised a few questions. 2 more dedicated spellweavers brought up the rear of the formation, ready to intervene if anything tried to take a swing at Mila. No jokes, no chit-chat. Only a tenseness that was all simmering, angry readiness. Even Mila's brutal chopping through the foliage did not take the edge off of her feelings, and the knowledge that they were looking for bodies did not take the edge off of her feelings, the knowledge that they were looking for bodies undispelled. From the forefront of her mind. She had liked the Bletom boys, damn it, even if they were acquaintances at best. That progress felt so slow only exacerbated her feelings, giving them more time to dwell on it all. It was hours of sidestepping clusters of poisonous vine plants before Roar's head snapped to the side, hard enough to make the others flinch from the force. She only gave a short "this way" before trundling onward, her usual slow gait somehow making it through the greenery without brushing against any of it. The rest of them were not channeling creepy magic to that degree, though, so Mila followed right behind, steel flashing. That put her up as the first person to That put her up as the first other person to react to the scene that Aurora guided them to, the pink kobold wrenching back and her blades stopping as she got some 15 feet from the nearest body. The last few handful of feet to cut through were the subjective slowest, but the others got up to Aurora just as the lunar self-hypnotism wore off, dumping the golden gal's full consciousness back into her body to suddenly experience the full brunt of the scene, resulting in her vomiting heavily, the distinct scent of a lot of rotting meat pulling the night's breakfast up from her stomach, up out of her stomach. And gods, it was so much rot. The fucked up centerpiece to the scene was one of the Bletums, although time, wet, and the attempts of scavengers prevented the human's body from being matched to a specific man. Attempts, because while scavengers had clearly gotten some amount of carry-on off of him, they had not gotten far with it. Birds and mammals falling dead around him, and them being scavenged themselves, seemingly more effectively. The man's left upper arm was simply sheared off through the bone, a cut that even Rora would have trouble replicating, but which decomposing arm belonged to the body was anyone's guess, because there were more potential partners than there were bodies they could belong to present. A couple legs too, one of which seemed to have been picked over by local critters much more safely than the other parts. Conspicuously absent were the rest of the Bletom's corpses, and a part of Mila was glad for that, even if the rest of her hated the thought. They had recovered bodies before, seen death, even had to kill before, but Mila had to look away from this and steady herself, just catching a reaction, to breathe deep before the mistake could be made. Maybe weeks of exposure to the elements were bad enough, but whatever poison he had suffered from, in turn killing off the large amount of scavengers, made the whole thing worse, preventing them from helping the decomposing process while adding their own bodies to the mess. If this was one body, 5 would have been so goddamn worse. Mila could do little for this part of the job too, but where before she had been angry at her inability to help, now the same small part was louder, and she was a bit grateful that she did not have to deal with all of that, not directly. So while Aluka and Nana began to assess how best to collect and transport the remains of the deceased with their magical nonsense, the other 3 began a slow perimeter through the trees around the field of corpses. They were looking for any sign of the others or what was responsible, and while they moved, Mila racked her memories for what could do anything like that. She and Rora were from more up north originally, hailing from a different Koboldian settlement buried underneath the mountain range that had a lot of names, but was mostly known as the Spine. Not all the animals down here amongst the shoulder were present up there, but Mila felt like she had a decent grasp on most of the wildlife, critters and monsters alike, for both areas. She was turning up empty for anything that could be responsible for that kind of poisoning. The most venomous things that came to mind were a few snakes, for instance, but those did not make sense. No rattler, of much of any size, was going to wipe out so many people, nor would it have been cleaving through an arm bone. And that was all ignoring the weirdest bit. Anything hunting with poison wanted to preserve its resource-intensive chemical weapons as much as it could. Putting enough poison into a person to, in turn, kill off anything poaching from the kill spoke of a kind of malice that Mila did not like attributing to an animal. That felt uncomfortably like the realm of people in a different way than the wiles of a yodel spoke of trickery and hunger. Unfortunately, between the weather that had run through and the detritivores coming through to have their last meals, the trio did not find any sign of what had been the cause or where the others' bodies might be. Roar's channeling also took a lot out of her, and her footsteps were heavy, a sure sign she could not repeat their performance. Without magic to kick them to the next location, there was little they could do without waiting around, delaying their return. And beyond that, they had gotten what they came for, knowledge of the fates of the Bleton boys, as incomplete as that knowledge might be. By the time they walked the whole way around and came back in, it seemed Luca and Nana had put together an actionable plan. The former was busy setting up a long-lasting telekinesis spell form to help move and transport the remains in the coming week, while the latter was busy giving an in-depth prayer to request a blessing on a large, thin bag. The Knoll worshipped the goddess of feasts, who was not a deity one normally associated with adventuring, but their holy person joining the group had quickly dispelled the idea that they were poorly suited at the job. Nana's cooking alone would be plenty reason to keep them solidly in the group, morale boost helping everyone to perform their best. But it had become clear that all the different aspects of feasts could be creatively applied. The sluggishness of gorging on a big meal was deadly when snaked through an enemy in the midst of a fight, as was the growing hunger of an anticipated buffet. Food with divine magic infused through it could bolster more than just attitude. Bags meant to preserve food for long trips were more than suitable to safely transport remains without them decomposing further or risking illness to the bearers. It made Mila kind of queasy to think about, and the mental logic in there felt a little suspicious. Not because preserving foods and a corpse were different mechanisms, no, but because the goddess of feasts did not mind what felt like a loophole. It was, presumably, fine by her, and Mila did not like to think of someone she had shared drinks with in the same category as food. Even if that interpretation was in the goddess's mind, though, Mila had to admit that still would make her one of the deities that unsettled her the least. In a land, in a way, a deity governing hunger, considering everything to be equally valid as food, made sense. And more importantly, the straightforwardness of it was something she could personally appreciate. You knew where you stood with someone like that, even if you did not like that you were standing in their mouth. The more insidious shit was what Mila had a strong aversion to. Very much not a fan of the god of family and the frankly horrifying things his followers preached on how a family should look like. A fun fact, this tidbit was a heavily contributing factor to my first hater review of this work. The review has since been edited, which is weak of that reviewer, but that's okay. The unknowable things out there the unknowable things out there that granted similar power, be it the space mage bullshit Rory utilized or the tapping into natural forces that Eustace dabbled in, were more nebulous to Mila's thoughts. There was less explicit guidance behind those forces, less visible purpose, and a lack of organized faith. But that did not mean there was not something there, pressing buttons and pulling levers behind the curtains. And that potential paranoia kept Mila on edge about those ideas. Luca's studied magic, actual wizard bullshit, was at least something that Mila could grasp the high points of. You took A, added B, and got result C, where A and B were weird bits and pieces of significant stuff that required specialized training to use and see was an explosive orb of fire or something. Well, sure, she supposed that she could consider divine magic as much the same, where the ingredients were faith and knowing the domain of the deity, but well, oh, don't worry, Senna. I still have that review. I screen capped it and have for a very long time been meaning to actually print it out and frame it because I don't know, having a hater kind of feels good. I will see if I can't bring it up on screen with the user's username cropped out uh, at the end of the stream. I'm just saying, if my work is good enough to hate on, that's good enough for me. Once she was able to stab a god like she could stab a vial of mercury, she might consider them to be equal. Until then, deities could just bite her tail. All her theology and thaumaturgy philosophizing was to distract the kobold from the work going on in front of her, a fact that she gave a wide mental berth to, not wanting to startle that bit of information to action. 4 planes of telekinetic force delicately picked up the human remains, allowing Nana to slide the bag down the length, Mage's magic not interfering with the bag. Once it was in place, the gnoll kept the bag open, and the other limbs were gingerly collected and brought through. Once as much as was gotten as could be managed, the bag was sealed. The awful nightmare smell that tried to pry its way into Mila's nose and get down to her forked tongue did not go away that easily. Even as they left the rot-strewn length of forest and began the lengthy, sullen journey back, the stench stuck with them, with all of them, long after the wind had carried it far away. For prospective chapter titles, no jokes, no chit-chat. The Bleton Boys, Unknowable Things, or actual wizard bullshit. Okay, I do use wizard bullshit later on, so I don't have to make that the chapter title this time around. But it is still a good one. Yeah, I'll use it. I do feel like most wizards would also categorize as actual wizard bullshit, so. Okay, give me one moment. I'm going to transfer a file on over. At the 2 hour and a half mark or so, I will admit my voice is getting a little raspy. Um, One moment. I do not know why I am struggling as hard as I am to find the review. Oh, here it is. Okay, marking out the username and time that the review was made. One moment, just attaching it over so I can switch devices. Okay, there we go. Sent it over. And I will be attempting to stream another 5 or so chapters of reading and editing for next week. I haven't nailed down 100% what my schedule's going to look like consistently. Things are up in the air and all that, but writing Wednesday at least has some alliteration behind it, so might be trying to stick with that going forward. And part of why I'm here streaming is to kind of obligate myself into writing more. Some 30 chapters plus prologue are currently published on Royal Road, which, oh yeah, I forgot to actually check comments as we went. But you can read through the rest of this if any of the handful of viewers feel like they cannot wait to get more of it until next week. Which, fair enough. My writing is awesome. My story is great. I'm not being able to load up my email account to get the review down. Um, oh well. I'll just assume that's an internet or a website's problem and not me. Next writing stream, I will have that review up ready. It was specifically a review up to chapter 5, so it's not going to have any big spoilers. Just some good stuff. very affirming. Yeah, feel free to leave comments on the story if you'd like. The With this editing pass and maybe a second reread, I will be republishing these chapters, so that will be updating things over here. I'm going to be doing an art stream tomorrow, and also doing that on a regular but not yet perfectly scheduled basis. So feel free to come in, check that out if you like. I did make my own little stream avatar here as I cough up a storm. Yeah. Tomorrow will likely be some isometric kind of rooms and landscapes art-wise. Hopefully it's fun. I'm certainly gonna have a good time. I'm rusty as hell with my pixel art, and it shows, but it still looks cute, so that's what I'm here for. I will also add a link to my Royal Road page, or at least Flipping Fantasylands page, within my Twitch details if you want a direct link, or just reach out. I don't have a big enough following, currently or whatever, for that to be an overwhelming problem I have to deal with. So I am probably going to log off, getting close to the 3 hour mark. Pretty proud of myself here. Everyone has a good rest of your evening. Hopefully see you all next time.